When Ella Wendel died in 1931, over 2,000 people claimed her fortune. Not one of them had ever been invited into her home. The sisters owned half of Manhattan, but lived like paupers in a crumbling mansion, wearing rags worth billions. There is a peculiar silence that belongs only to abandoned wealth. It settles into the corners of rooms where chandeliers once blazed, where orchestras once played, where laughter should echo but doesn't. Walk down Fifth Avenue today, and you won't find number 442. The address exists, certainly, but the building that once stood there has been erased, replaced by glass and steel towers humming with contemporary life. Yet if you know where to look, if you understand what questions to ask, you can still feel the ghost of what happened here. A family fortune worth billions, a mansion falling into ruin while its owners sat inside, watching their empire crumble around them. And the most disturbing part? They wanted it this way. The photographs that survive tell a story more unsettling than any fiction. 7 faces stare out from faded sepia tones, arranged in the formal Victorian manner, shoulders touching but eyes distant. 6 women and 1 man, dressed in black silk and starched collars, expressions that suggest they're posing not for a portrait, but for a funeral. The Wendel siblings, names that once commanded respect in Manhattan's corridors of power. Ella, Rebecca, Georgiana, Mary, Louisa, Josephine, and John. By the time this photograph was taken in the early 1900s, they owned more of Manhattan than most people could walk in a day. Property stretching from the Bowery to the Hudson, from 14th Street to the northern reaches of development. Real estate that today would be valued not in millions, but in billions, plural, with a B that stands for incomprehensible. But look closer at those faces. See the way the sisters' hands clutch at their dark dresses. Notice how none of them smile. Not even the polite half-smile Victorians typically offered the camera. These are not the faces of triumph. These are the faces of people who have made a terrible bargain and are beginning to understand its cost. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue was their fortress and their tomb. Built in the 1860s when Fifth Avenue still meant something, when it represented the pinnacle of New York society, the structure rose 4 stories of brownstone and marble, with soaring ceilings and windows that should have flooded rooms with light. Should have. In the Wendel mansion, curtains stayed drawn. The house had 30 rooms, each more elaborate than the last, decorated in the heavy ornate style of mid-19th century prosperity. Gilt mirrors reflected nothing because no one looked into them. Ballrooms designed for 200 guests stood empty, except for the sisters moving through them like ghosts in their own haunted house. Imagine walking past this building in 1925. The jazz age is exploding around you. Flappers are shortening their hemlines. Jazz is pouring from speakeasy doors. Automobiles are replacing horses, and the city is reinventing itself every 6 months. You're walking up Fifth Avenue, past department stores with window displays that change weekly, past women in cloche hats and men in modern suits, past all the energy and chaos and brilliant possibility of the modern age. And then you reach 442. The building looks wrong. Not just old, but wrong. The stone is darkening with decades of coal smoke that no one has bothered to clean. The windows are draped in fabric so heavy that you can't see inside. The front steps, which should be swept daily, are accumulating leaves and dirt. There's something about the place that makes you quicken your pace, that triggers an ancestral unease about houses where life has stopped, but death hasn't quite arrived. Inside those walls, the Wendel sisters were living in 1870. Not metaphorically, literally. They wore dresses cut in styles that had been fashionable when Grant was president. They used furniture their father had purchased half a century earlier. They cooked on stoves that belonged in a museum. They read by gaslight long after electricity had become commonplace. And they did this not from poverty, but from choice. From a conviction so deep and so pathological that it had calcified into their very identities. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. These women owned buildings where modern life was happening. Their tenants were installing telephones, buying radios, hosting cocktail parties, living the lives of 20th century urbanites. The rent checks that arrived each month represented contemporary commerce, contemporary relationships, contemporary engagement with the world. But the Wendels never cashed most of them immediately. They stacked them in drawers, on desks, in boxes, as if money were something to be possessed rather than used. The properties generated enormous income that accumulated in bank accounts the sisters never drew from, that compounded and grew while they darned their own stockings and ate simple meals prepared on equipment that predated the Civil War. What kind of wealth is this? What does it mean to own half of Manhattan but live like a spinster in reduced circumstances? The question cuts to something deeper than economics. It exposes a philosophy, a worldview, a set of beliefs about safety and danger that had metastasized into madness. The neighbors noticed? Of course they noticed. In a city as densely packed and socially complex as New York, you can't hide a mystery this profound. Servants who worked briefly for the Wendels before being dismissed for reasons they never understood would whisper to other servants. Delivery men who brought coal or food to the service entrance would describe the glimpses they caught of the interior. Rooms stacked with newspapers from decades past, furniture covered in sheets, paintings turned to face the walls as if beauty itself had become unbearable. Society matrons who had once known the Wendel sisters, back when such acquaintance was still possible, would shake their heads and wonder what had happened to those girls, how they had transformed from the daughters of a respected businessman into phantoms who rejected every invitation, answered no letters, and attended no events. The transformation hadn't been sudden. That's what made it so insidious. There was no single moment when the Wendels decided to withdraw from the world. Instead, there had been a gradual tightening, a progressive constriction of the boundaries of acceptable interaction, a slow retreat that accelerated over years until the sisters found themselves in a place so isolated that the journey back seemed impossible, even if they had wanted to make it. But did they want to? That's the question that haunts anyone who studies this story. Were the Wendel sisters prisoners, or were they guards? Were they trapped by circumstances, or by choices? The answer, as with all profound tragedies, is both. They had inherited more than property. They had inherited a pathology, a way of seeing the world that divided humanity into two categories: family and threat. And when you believe that everyone outside your bloodline is a potential enemy, when you're convinced that the world wants to steal what you have, when you trust no one and nothing except the increasingly narrow circle of your siblings, then isolation isn't imprisonment, it's protection. It's the only logical response to a hostile universe. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue was more than a building. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological state. Its heavy curtains weren't just blocking light, they were blocking connection. Its locked doors weren't just keeping strangers out, they were keeping the sisters in. And year by year, as the world outside modernized and evolved and moved forward, the world inside those walls moved backward, retreating into memories of a time when Father was alive and everything made sense, and the rules were clear. What they couldn't see, what they refused to see, was that the very fortune they were protecting so obsessively was becoming meaningless through their protection. Wealth without purpose is just numbers on paper. Property without use is just dirt and stone. Safety without joy is just another name for death. The story of the Wendel sisters begins here, in this house that is both palace and prison, with 7 people who had everything except the one thing that might have saved them: the courage to trust someone outside themselves. What follows is not a tale of villains and heroes. It's something more disturbing than that. It's the story of how fear, inherited and nurtured and fed for decades, can transform abundance into poverty, safety into danger, and family into a cage from which there is no escape except the one escape no one wants. Every fortune begins with a decision. The Wendel fortune began with a simple command that would echo through generations like a curse disguised as wisdom. John Gottlieb Wendel, the family patriarch, spoke it to his son John Daniel around 1801. Buy, but never sell, New York real estate. 4 words that seemed sensible at the time, 4 words that would eventually strangle his grandchildren. John Gottlieb Wendel arrived in New York sometime around 1710, part of the Palatine migration that brought German Protestants fleeing religious persecution across the Atlantic. He started as most immigrants did, with nothing but ambition and the willingness to work. The fur trade made him prosperous. By the early 1800s, he was established enough to marry into the Astor family. His wife was John Jacob Astor's sister-in-law, and family legend insisted that it was Wendel who first suggested to Astor the idea of investing in Manhattan real estate. Whether this was true or simply the kind of story wealthy families tell themselves doesn't matter. What matters is that both men made the same gamble on the same island at roughly the same time, and both became extraordinarily rich. But where Astor became a public figure, Wendel remained in shadow. He accumulated properties quietly, methodically, without fanfare or self-promotion. His philosophy was simple to the point of rigidity. Acquire land, hold it, never mortgage it, never sell it, and wait for the city to grow around you. Manhattan in the early 1800s was still largely rural above 14th Street. Wendel understood what many didn't, that the city would inevitably expand northward, that land purchased today for hundreds would be worth thousands tomorrow, tens of thousands the day after that. His son John Daniel inherited this philosophy along with the properties. He expanded the holdings through the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, buying parcels throughout Lower Manhattan and beginning to push north along Broadway. The Wendels understood something fundamental about New York real estate. Broadway prices moved uptown at a rate of approximately 10 blocks per decade. If you could anticipate this movement, if you could buy land just before the wave of development reached it, you could turn modest investments into spectacular returns simply by waiting. By the time John Daniel died in 1859, he had transformed his father's comfortable fortune into something approaching magnificence. The estate was valued at $3 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the period. He left this fortune to 8 children, 7 daughters and 1 son. The daughters were Rebecca, Georgiana, Ella, Augusta, Josephine, Mary, and one whose name has been lost to history's selective memory. The son was John Gottlieb Wendel II, named for his grandfather, and it was upon his shoulders that the weight of the family destiny would fall most heavily. John Gottlieb Wendel II was born in 1856, the same year his father built the family mansion at 5th Avenue and 39th Street. He grew up surrounded by wealth that was never displayed, by properties that were never sold, by a philosophy of accumulation without consumption. His father died when John was just 3 years old, but the principles had already been established. The family attorney and his mother continued the management of the properties according to the established rules, and when John came of age, he assumed control with the fervor of a religious convert taking his vows. The rules were sacred. Never mortgage, because debt compromised independence. Never sell, because Manhattan would always become more valuable. Never repair beyond absolute necessity, because tenants should be grateful for location regardless of condition. And anticipate the movement of development, always positioning the family's holdings just ahead of the city's inexorable growth northward. John Gottlieb II added his own principles to the foundation his grandfather and father had laid. He held all property titles in his own name, maintaining absolute control. He established strict moral guidelines for tenants: no saloons, no theaters, no establishments that served alcohol. When negotiating a $1 million lease, he once delayed the entire deal to ensure that first aid kits in the building would contain no more than 1 pint of whiskey. Electric signs were forbidden on Wendel properties. Anything that smacked of modern commercialism, of the gaudy display of wealth, or the loosening of moral standards was rejected. But his most consequential principle had nothing to do with real estate management. It concerned his sisters. John Gottlieb II never married, and he made it his life's work to ensure that his sisters never married either. His reasoning was coldly logical. Marriage meant children, children meant heirs, heirs meant the eventual division of the estate. The only way to keep the Wendel fortune intact, the only way to honor what his grandfather and father had built, was to prevent any dilution of the bloodline. He didn't present this as tyranny. He presented it as protection. Every evening, he would gather his sisters and warn them about the dangers lurking beyond their doors. Fortune hunters, he told them, men who would pretend affection to gain access to Wendel wealth. He convinced them they were targets, that any man who showed interest was motivated by greed rather than genuine feeling. He told them, with apparent conviction, that they were not beautiful enough to inspire love on their own merits, that only their money made them desirable. The sisters believed him, or perhaps they simply had no choice but to believe him, having been raised in isolation, having seen no evidence to contradict his warnings, having developed no independent means of evaluating the world or their place in it. Male visitors were banned from the house. The sisters were permitted to leave only 1 evening per week, and only when accompanied by their brother. They wore the clothing styles of the 1870s well into the 20th century, as if time itself had stopped at the moment of their father's death. The fortune grew. By the early 1900s, the Wendels owned over 150 properties scattered across Manhattan. The holdings stretched from the Bowery to Fifth Avenue, from Wall Street to the Upper West Side. The family paid more in real estate taxes than the Rockefellers. When John Gottlieb II died in 1914, the estate was valued at $80 million, equivalent to billions in contemporary currency. He left behind properties generating immense rental income and clothing worth exactly $10. What he also left behind was something more insidious than wealth or poverty. He left a worldview. He left the conviction that safety required isolation, that preservation demanded rejection of the outside world, that the only people who could be trusted were those who shared your blood. He left 6 unmarried sisters who had internalized his paranoia so completely that they could no longer imagine any other way of living. He left a fortune that had become its own justification, that existed not to be used but simply to be maintained, to be passed down, to be kept pure and untouched, and ultimately meaningless. The tragedy of the Wendels didn't begin with the crumbling mansion or the isolated sisters or the wasted billions. It began here, in the early 19th century, with a philosophy that confused accumulation with success, preservation with purpose, and safety with life itself. When John Gottlieb Wendel II died in 1914, he left behind 6 sisters and a question that would define the remainder of their lives. What happens when the tyrant dies, but the tyranny remains? The estate he bequeathed was staggering. Over 150 properties scattered across Manhattan. Land on Broadway, parcels on the Lower East Side, holdings stretching from Wall Street to the emerging Upper West Side. The rental income alone could have funded a lifestyle of unimaginable luxury. The total value approached $80 million, a sum that translated to billions in contemporary terms. He had paid more in real estate taxes than the Rockefellers. His properties generated enough monthly income to buy mansions, yachts, entire fleets of automobiles. Yet when the estate was inventoried, his personal clothing was valued at $10. The sisters who survived him were Rebecca, Georgiana, Ella, Augusta, Josephine, and Mary. Their ages ranged from the 50s into the 70s. They had lived their entire adult lives under their brother's absolute control, and now that control had been lifted. The city held its breath, waiting to see what these wealthy women would do with their freedom. They did nothing. They changed nothing. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue remained exactly as it had been. The curtains stayed drawn. The gaslight continued to flicker in rooms where electricity should have blazed. The sisters continued to wear the same outdated clothing, continued to follow the same rigid schedule, continued to live as if their brother were still watching from some invisible vantage point, ready to criticize any deviation from established routine. But there was a subtle shift in power dynamics. Rebecca, the eldest surviving sister at 72, had always harbored the most resistance to her brother's control. In 1903, at the age of 61, she had achieved what none of her sisters could manage. She had escaped. She married Professor Luther Swope, taking her share of the family fortune with her, exactly as John had always feared. Now, with John dead and the remaining sisters aging, Rebecca attempted to assert authority over the estate. She moved back into the mansion periodically, trying to manage the properties and guide her sisters. Yet even Rebecca, the rebel who had dared to marry, could not break the psychological chains her brother had forged. The House of Mystery, as newspapers had begun calling it, remained mysterious. The sisters ventured out only at night, and even then, rarely. They employed minimal staff, trusting no one. They refused every modernization. Telephone companies approached them with offers to install lines. Rejected. Electric companies proposed to wire the building. Rejected. Automobile manufacturers suggested that women of their means should certainly own cars. The very idea was absurd. The tragedy of their inheritance wasn't the property or the money. It was the worldview that came packaged with it. John had convinced his sisters that they were targets, that the world wanted to exploit them, that safety lay only within the walls of the family mansion and the circle of family blood. He had told them they were not beautiful enough to inspire genuine affection, that any man who showed interest was a fortune hunter, that trust was a weakness that would lead to the dissolution of everything their grandfather and father had built. And the sisters believed him. Even after his death, even with the tyrant gone, they could not imagine any other truth. The paranoia had become their identity. The isolation had become their protection. The stagnation had become their stability. The mansion itself was becoming a monument to decay. The four-story brownstone structure, built in the 1850s when Fifth Avenue meant social prestige, now stood surrounded by commercial development. Department stores had risen on neighboring lots. Office buildings were replacing residential homes. The area around them was transforming into the commercial heart of Midtown Manhattan, and the Wendel mansion sat like a rotten tooth in an otherwise gleaming smile. Inside, dust accumulated on furniture that should have been replaced decades earlier. Carpets wore through in patterns that mapped the sisters' limited movements through their prison. The kitchen still used a coal stove. The plumbing belonged to a previous century. In summer, the house baked because opening windows meant exposure to the gaze of passers-by. In winter, inadequate heating systems left the sisters huddled in layers of clothing, billionaires living like paupers because spending money on comfort felt like betrayal of the accumulation principle. They held trust funds that John had established to avoid taxation. The properties continued to generate income. The wealth continued to compound. And the sisters continued to live in a house that was simultaneously worth millions and falling apart around them. Georgiana's fate revealed the depth of the family's dysfunction. She had attempted escape years earlier, booking into a boarding house under a false name, trying to taste independence even briefly. John had responded with fury that bordered on madness. He hired 29 private detectives. He paid beggars and bootblacks to search for her. When she was found, he had her declared incompetent and committed to an asylum for the mentally insane. There she remained, a woman whose only crime was wanting to live her own life, locked away because she threatened the integrity of the family fortune. She would die in that institution in 1924, never having regained her freedom. Augusta suffered a similar fate. When she showed signs of rebellion, John had her declared incompetent as well. The legal mechanisms existed to control women in ways that seem unthinkable now, and John wielded those mechanisms without hesitation or remorse. The surviving sisters must have known these stories intimately. They must have understood what happened to those who attempted to break free. The lesson was clear. Submission was survival. Acceptance was safety. And so they accepted. They submitted. They lived in their golden cage and convinced themselves it was a castle. Rebecca died in 1930, leaving the mansion and its mysteries to her remaining sisters. By then, only Ella and Mary were left in the great house, two elderly women moving through 40 rooms like ghosts haunting their own lives. Mary passed away shortly after, and then there was only Ella. Ella Virginia von Wendel, the youngest daughter, the final guardian of a fortune that had guarded nothing but loneliness. She was in her late 70s, living alone in a mansion designed for large families and grand entertaining, surrounded by wealth that had never brought joy and possessions that had never been used. She had her poodles. She named them all Toby, one after another, as if even her dogs were interchangeable components of a system rather than individual beings worthy of unique names. Late at night, she would venture into the backyard to let the current Toby run, declining offers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for that small patch of land. Real estate developers looked at that property with tears in their eyes, seeing the fortune that could be made, unable to understand why an old woman would reject their offers. But Ella understood something they didn't. The backyard wasn't about land value. It was the last small space where she could exist without feeling observed, without feeling judged, without feeling the weight of the world pressing against the walls of her isolation. It was her tiny kingdom, and she would rather die than sell it. The inheritance the Wendel sisters received in 1914 wasn't measured in properties or dollars. It was measured in beliefs about the world, in assumptions about human nature, in a philosophy that confused preservation with purpose. They inherited buildings, yes, but more fundamentally, they inherited a prison. And unlike prisoners who dream of freedom, the Wendel sisters had been convinced that the prison was the only safe place in a hostile world. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue was dying the way empires die, slowly, visibly, while the world pretended not to notice. By the 1920s, it had become an anachronism so profound that tour buses stopped at the corner specifically to let passengers gawk. The building that John Daniel Wendel had constructed in the 1850s as a symbol of arrival had transformed into a monument to refusal. Around it, Fifth Avenue was reinventing itself. Residential mansions fell to make way for department stores and office towers. The avenue was becoming commercial, vertical, electric with the energy of modern commerce. And there, squatting like a tombstone among the living, stood the Wendel house. The contrast was architectural violence. Neighboring buildings blazed with electric signs and plate glass windows. The Wendel mansion kept its curtains drawn against the 20th century. While nearby structures installed elevators and central heating, the Wendel house remained lit by gaslight. The coal stove in the kitchen belonged in a museum. Inside, the decay was advancing like a disease. Paint peeled from walls in long strips, revealing layers of time like geological strata. Carpets wore through along the paths the sisters walked daily, their routes so predictable that the degradation mapped their movements. The gilt mirrors that had once reflected candlelit soirees now reflected nothing but dimness and decline. The sisters moved through this deterioration like ghosts haunting their own lives. They wore dresses cut in 1870s styles, the fabric so old it was beginning to disintegrate. Ella would venture out occasionally, dressed in clothing so outdated that passers-by would stop and stare. She pushed a baby carriage containing not an infant, but Toby, her French poodle, dressed in silk and attended to with more care than the sisters showed themselves. The backyard became legendary. A 12-foot wall topped with nails surrounded it, built by John to ensure privacy. Real estate. Developers looked at that small patch of earth and saw millions. They made offers, substantial offers that could have funded repairs to the mansion. Ella refused them all. The yard was where Toby exercised. That was reason enough to reject any amount of money. The press dubbed them the Weird Wendels. The mansion became known as the House of Mystery. Newspapers ran stories speculating about what happened behind those heavy curtains. The truth was both simpler and more tragic. They were living exactly as they had been taught to live, following rules established by a dead patriarch, unable to imagine any alternative. By the late 1920s, only Ella and Mary remained in the great house. Two elderly women in 40 rooms, moving through the same patterns they had followed for decades. When Mary died, Ella was left entirely alone, except for Toby and a minimal staff she barely trusted. At night, she would take Toby into the yard. Tour buses still stopped at the corner. Tourists would press their faces against the gaps, trying to catch a glimpse of the eccentric heiress, the woman who owned half of Manhattan but lived like a Victorian ghost. Ella must have known they were watching. She must have understood that her life had become a spectacle, that her tragedy was entertainment for people who could not comprehend how someone could have everything and nothing simultaneously. The mansion was a perfect metaphor for the sisters' existence. Grand in conception, solid in construction, valuable beyond calculation, and utterly uninhabitable. The pathology didn't just live in the mansion. It lived in the sisters themselves, woven into their thoughts like a virus replicating through every cell of their consciousness. John had succeeded in something more terrible than imprisonment. He had convinced his sisters that the bars of their cage were actually shields protecting them from a hostile world. When Georgiana attempted to escape at 50 years old, checking into the Park Avenue Hotel under a false name, John's response revealed the depths of his tyranny. He hired 29 private detectives to track her down. He paid beggars and bootblacks to search the streets. When she was found, he had her committed to the psychopathic ward at Bellevue Hospital. A sheriff's jury declared her insane. Her crime? Wanting to live independently. Her punishment? Years in an asylum, then forced return to the mansion where she would eventually die, still imprisoned. Augusta faced similar treatment when she showed resistance. The legal system of the era permitted men to declare women incompetent with disturbing ease, and John wielded this power without hesitation. These weren't isolated incidents of discipline. They were object lessons, warnings to the other sisters about what happened to those who dared imagine freedom. The remaining sisters absorbed these lessons completely. They made their own clothes in outdated styles, wearing the round sailor hats popular in the 1870s well into the 20th century. They maintained a minimal staff, distrusting servants who might report their eccentricities to the outside world. When they ventured out at all, it was only at night, as if sunlight itself were dangerous. Their summers revealed another dimension of their strangeness. The family maintained a country estate in Irvington, New York, where they kept cows, chickens, and a kitchen garden. For people worth tens of millions of dollars, this agricultural lifestyle was bizarre. They weren't playing at farming as a hobby. They were producing their own food because purchasing it required trusting merchants, trusting delivery systems, trusting the world beyond their control. John's control extended even to religion. When Rebecca dared to marry Professor Luther Swope in 1903, defying her brother at age 61, John responded by forbidding his remaining sisters from attending church. If marriage was a threat to family unity, then the church that sanctified marriage must also be dangerous. The logic was insane, but internally consistent, and the sisters accepted it. The rental properties they owned generated enormous auction income, but the sisters rarely touched it. Money accumulated in accounts they never drew from. They negotiated million-dollar leases while wearing clothing they had sewn themselves from fabric purchased decades earlier. When John insisted on delaying a major lease until he received guarantees that first aid kits in the building would contain no more than 1 pint of whiskey, it wasn't about temperance. It was about control, about imposing his moral vision on a world he couldn't otherwise dominate. Electric signs were forbidden on Wendel properties. Theaters were prohibited. Saloons were banned. These weren't just business decisions. They were declarations of war against modernity itself, against the loosening of Victorian moral codes, against the jazz age that was exploding around them. The sisters internalized these prohibitions until they became reflexive. When telephone companies offered to install lines in the mansion, the answer was automatic refusal. When automobile manufacturers suggested that women of their wealth should own cars, the idea seemed not just unnecessary, but offensive. Why would they need telephones when they spoke to no one? Why would they need automobiles when they went nowhere? Ella's attachment to her poodles became legendary. She named each one Toby, as if the dogs themselves were interchangeable, as if individuality were something to be avoided even in pets. She would venture into the backyard late at night to exercise the current Toby, and this became her one concession to the outside world. Real estate developers made offers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for that small yard. She rejected them all without negotiation. The yard wasn't about land value. It was about having one small space where she felt safe, where the walls were high enough and the hour late enough that the world couldn't observe her. Tour buses began stopping at the mansion, their guides announcing the presence of the weird Wendels to passengers who craned their necks hoping for a glimpse. The sisters had become a spectacle, a tourist attraction, proof that wealth and sanity were not synonymous. Newspapers printed stories about their eccentricities. The House of Mystery became shorthand for a particular kind of Manhattan strangeness. Wealth turned inward until it became indistinguishable from poverty. But the cruelest aspect of their pathology was this: the sisters didn't recognize themselves as victims. They had been so thoroughly convinced of the danger beyond their walls that isolation felt like wisdom. Rejection of modernity felt like preservation of values. Living in decay felt like honoring their father's memory. They had constructed a complete worldview that justified every deprivation, every limitation, every wasted day. John had died in 1914, but his ghost ruled the house for another 17 years. His voice echoed in every decision his sisters made, in every opportunity they declined, in every day they chose the prison over freedom. He had succeeded in creating something more permanent than buildings or bank accounts. He had created a belief system that would outlive him, that would guide his sisters to their graves, that would ensure the fortune he protected so obsessively would ultimately mean nothing at all. Death came to the Wendels the way it comes to all families, but in their case, each passing tightened the noose of isolation until only silence remained. John Gottlieb Wendel II died in 1914 at 58 years old. The tyrant who had orchestrated his sister's imprisonment, who had hired detectives to hunt down Georgiana, who had forbidden church attendance and social interaction, who had convinced 6 women that marriage meant betrayal, finally released his grip on the world. But tyranny doesn't die with tyrants. It lives in the systems they create, in the beliefs they instill, in the patterns they establish as normal. The sisters who survived him were already elderly. Rebecca was 72. The others ranged through their 60s and into their 50s. They had spent their entire adult lives under John's control, and now that control had been lifted. Yet nothing changed. They continued wearing the same outdated clothing. They continued refusing modern conveniences. They continued living in the mansion as if John were still watching from some invisible vantage point, ready to criticize any deviation from established routine. Georgiana died in 1924, still bearing the psychological scars of her attempted escape and subsequent institutionalization. She had tried to taste freedom at 50, checking into the Park Avenue Hotel under a false name, and John had responded with fury that bordered on madness. 29 detectives, a commitment to Bellevue's psychopathic ward, years in an asylum for daring to want independence. She never fully recovered from that punishment, and when death finally came, it must have felt like the only escape she would ever achieve. Rebecca, the eldest, had been the family rebel. In 1903, at 61 years old, she had done what her sisters could not. She married Professor Luther Swope. John had raged, but Rebecca had already removed herself from his immediate control. She took her share of the family fortune with her, proving John's deepest fear valid. Marriage did mean the dispersal of wealth. After John's death, Rebecca attempted to assert authority over the remaining sisters and the estate. She moved back into the mansion periodically, trying to guide her siblings, trying perhaps to undo some of the damage her brother had inflicted. But even Rebecca, the one who had dared to break free, could not liberate her sisters from the prison in their minds. She died in 1930, having witnessed the slow extinction of her family line. Mary passed away shortly after Rebecca, leaving the great mansion to just 2 occupants, Ella and Augusta. 2 elderly women in 40 rooms, moving through spaces designed for large families and grand entertaining, surrounded by furniture covered in dust and memories that grew heavier with each passing year. Then Augusta died, and Ella was alone. Ella Virginia von Eczel-Wendel, the youngest of the siblings, became the final guardian of everything the family had built and everything they had destroyed in the building. She was in her late 70s when her last sister died, living in a mansion that was simultaneously worth millions and falling apart. The servants had been dismissed or had quit, unable to bear the eccentricity and suspicion. The rooms echoed with emptiness. The gaslight flickered in spaces that should have been blazing with electricity. Ella's attachment to her poodles became the city's running joke. She named each one Toby, as if dogs were interchangeable parts rather than individual companions. Late at night, she would venture into the backyard to exercise the current Toby, declining offers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for that small patch of land. Real estate developers would approach with proposals that could have funded a comfortable final decade. She rejected them without negotiation. The yard was her kingdom, her one small space where the walls were high enough that the world couldn't observe her. Tour buses made the Wendel mansion a regular stop. Guides would announce the presence of the last Wendel sister. To passengers who pressed their faces against windows, hoping for a glimpse of the eccentric heiress. Newspapers ran stories about her bizarre lifestyle. The woman who owned half of Manhattan but lived like a pauper. The billionaire who wore rags. The heiress who had everything and nothing. But what the newspapers didn't understand, what the tourists couldn't comprehend, was that Ella wasn't eccentric by choice. She was the final product of a system designed over 3 generations to value preservation over participation, safety over experience, blood over love. She had been raised to believe that the outside world was dangerous, that other people were threats, that trust was weakness. These weren't beliefs she chose. They were beliefs that had been carved into her consciousness before she was old enough to question them. She lived alone in the mansion for several years, moving through the same rooms her siblings had inhabited, following the same routines, wearing the same outdated clothing. The properties continued to generate income that accumulated in accounts she barely touched. The fortune grew while she lived in conditions that would shame the poor. The irony was perfect and terrible. The wealthiest woman in Manhattan lived like someone who had lost everything. On March 13, 1931, Ella died in her sleep at age 80. No family surrounded her bed. No children mourned her passing. No grandchildren would carry forward her name. She died as she had lived for decades, alone, isolated, the final victim of a philosophy that had confused accumulation with purpose. The empire that 3 generations of Wendels had built so obsessively, that they had protected so jealously, that they had sacrificed their lives to preserve, ended not with celebration, but with silence. The last Wendel was gone, and with her died any possibility that the fortune would remain in family hands. There were no direct heirs, no children, no grandchildren. The obsessive preservation had guaranteed the very dissolution John had feared most. The circle was complete. The tragedy that began with John Gottlieb Wendel's command to his son had reached its inevitable conclusion. Buy but never sell. Accumulate but never spend. Preserve but never use. Trust no one outside the family. The philosophy had been followed perfectly, and it had destroyed everything it touched. Ella left behind over 150 properties scattered across Manhattan. Bank accounts containing millions, possessions worth fortunes, and clothing valued at almost nothing. She left behind a mansion that symbolized everything wrong with confusing wealth, with meaning, preservation with purpose, safety with life. She left behind a cautionary tale about what happens when fear becomes identity, when isolation becomes protection, when the walls built to keep danger out become the bars that keep life out. When Ella Wendel passed away in 1931, the Wendel fortune erupted into chaos. With no direct heirs, over 2,000 individuals came forward, each one claiming a right to the fortune worth more than $100 million, an amount that would now be valued in the billions. The courts were flooded with fraudulent claims, long-lost relatives, and outright imposters. Each one fought for a piece of a fortune that, until Ella's death, had been fiercely guarded in its isolation. The legal battle that ensued was nothing short of legendary. As the courtroom doors opened, a parade of distant relatives, some of whom had never met the Wendel sisters, rushed in with fabricated documents, presenting dubious claims to the wealth. It became clear the Wendels, in their relentless pursuit of isolation, had severed every meaningful connection to the outside world. These claims only exposed the true depth of the Wendels' retreat from society, a retreat that had lasted for decades, one where family, friendships, and any form of kinship outside their immediate circle had been erased. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Despite the best efforts of the Wendels' attorneys to block every attempt to claim the inheritance, the fortune grew ever more difficult to protect. The vast web of properties, worth billions by today's standards, was now fragmented by fraudulent claims, each piece of real estate drawn into the storm of competing interests. For the Wendels, the empire their ancestors had built, the empire they had fiercely protected, began to slip through their fingers, dissolving like dust in the wind. Ella, the last of the sisters, had been the keeper of their secrets and the final gatekeeper of their wealth. She, too, had seen the writing on the wall, the unraveling of a world they had tried so hard to preserve. As the battle wore on, the true tragedy of the Wendels' inheritance became clear. The fortune they had fought so hard to protect could not be used. It was a curse disguised as a blessing. The very isolation that had kept them safe from the outside world had rendered them prisoners within their own wealth. The fight for the Wendel fortune was not just a legal contest. It was a tragedy of human nature, a reflection of how fear and distrust could turn wealth into a prison. The fortune that was meant to bring freedom had only led to further division. It was a fortune never enjoyed, a prize claimed by so many, yet touched by none. What had begun as a noble effort to preserve a family legacy had ended in an inheritance of greed and deceit. In the end, the Wendels' vast fortune, meant to secure their legacy, only ensured that the very thing they had built was lost forever. The Fifth Avenue mansion, once the proud symbol of the Wendel family's wealth and legacy, met its end in the early 1930s. After the passing of Ella, the last of the Wendel sisters, the mansion was sold and quickly demolished, replaced by modern skyscrapers that towered over the empty lot. What had once been the jewel of Fifth Avenue was now just a memory, buried beneath the concrete and glass of Manhattan's relentless transformation. The properties scattered across Manhattan, once an empire of unimaginable value, were liquidated in a frenzy. The vast portfolio that had provided the Wendels with wealth and power now became little more than assets to be sold off for legal fees and creditors. The same properties that had made them untouchable in their isolation were now claimed by distant relatives, developers, and opportunists, each one trying to stake a claim on the fortune the Wendels had never fully embraced. Within years, the empire built by John Gottlieb Wendel in the early 18th century was dissolved. The fortune that had been carefully protected for generations was gone, dispersed to those with no connection to the Wendels other than the legal claim they could make to it. The mansion on Fifth Avenue was no longer a sanctuary for the sisters. It had become a relic of a time and a philosophy that had long since outlived its usefulness. In the end, the Wendel legacy crumbled under the weight of its own protection. The sisters' obsessive desire to preserve their wealth, their legacy, and their isolation had turned into their downfall. They had locked themselves away in their mansion, rejecting the outside world. And when that world finally came to claim its due, there was nothing left but the crumbling remnants of what had once been. As the city around the mansion flourished and evolved, the Wendel story faded into the background, a cautionary tale of how wealth without purpose, preservation without participation, and safety without connection could lead to the most tragic end imaginable. The empire that had been built with such careful precision had ultimately been dismantled with the same ruthless efficiency. The wealth that was meant to secure the family's place in history had instead sealed its fate. The mansion that had stood as a symbol of the Wendels' wealth and status was now gone, replaced by the towering buildings that symbolized the future. The empire had vanished, its pieces scattered across Manhattan, and with it, the final chapter of the Wendel family came to a quiet, unremarkable end. The mansion, once a monument to success, had become nothing more than a memory, fading like the lives of the sisters who had lived inside it. As the last of the Wendel sisters passed from the world, the question lingered in the air. What did the Wendels actually inherit? They had amassed an enormous fortune, a sprawling empire of properties and wealth that should have afforded them every luxury imaginable. But as the legal battles over their inheritance raged, a deeper, more disturbing truth began to emerge. The Wendel sisters had inherited more than just gold and property. They had inherited a worldview, one that had transformed their fortune into a curse rather than a blessing. The Wendel family's fortune, which once seemed like a symbol of triumph, had become a prison. The empire, built with precision and ruthlessness by John Gottlieb Wendel, had been maintained with a singular goal: to preserve the family's wealth and bloodline. But in that pursuit, they had lost something far more valuable: connection to the world and to the people who could have made their lives meaningful. Instead, they chose isolation. They lived as prisoners in a mansion filled with empty rooms surrounded by possessions they never used, wealth they never spent, and a world they refused to participate in. John Gottlieb Wendel, the patriarch, had instilled in his children a belief that the outside world was a dangerous place. He warned his daughters that any man who expressed interest in them was a fortune hunter, that the world was full of enemies, and that the only true protection came from within the family. As a result, the sisters became more and more insular, unable to see beyond the walls of their mansion. John's teachings were passed down through generations, seeping into every decision they made, every action they took. They were taught to fear the world, to fear anyone who wasn't family, and most dangerously, to fear connection itself. This fear became their identity. It was not just a mindset, but a way of life, woven so deeply into the fabric of their existence that they could not see beyond it. The mansion, with its drawn curtains and locked doors, was not just a house. It was a fortress, one built to keep the world out, but also to keep them in. The fortune they had inherited, instead of offering them freedom, had bound them tighter to their isolation. Wealth that could have opened doors, allowed them to explore the world and live without fear, became the very thing that kept them confined. The empire of properties, worth billions today, became meaningless to the sisters. Their wealth was simply a symbol of their inability to trust anyone or anything outside their own bloodline. In the years after John Gottlieb II's death in 1914, the sisters continued to live in their decaying mansion, clinging to the past. The world outside had changed. New York was reinventing itself, buzzing with the energy of the Jazz Age, with skyscrapers replacing brownstones and the city evolving into a modern metropolis. Yet inside the mansion, time had stopped. The sisters refused to embrace the present, instead living in the past as if their father's rigid principles still held sway over them. They rejected modernity, new technologies, new ideas, new ways of living, because they had been taught that such things were a threat to their way of life. They refused to adapt, to engage with the world that was rapidly moving forward without them. And in this refusal to engage with the present, the Wendels found themselves in the grip of a tragic paradox. Their father's wealth was meant to protect them, but it had become their prison. The protection they sought, the safety they craved, turned into a life of loneliness and stagnation. The fortune that should have brought them comfort and security was now the very thing that kept them from experiencing the joys and challenges of life outside their walls. Instead of freedom, they had inherited fear. The Wendel fortune, rather than providing the sisters with a life of ease and luxury, had become a symbol of their inability to trust, to engage, and to live. Their wealth had isolated them from the world, and it was that isolation that ultimately became their downfall. In the end, the fortune that was meant to secure their future only ensured their spiritual death. What they had inherited was not just gold or property, but a way of life that trapped them in a cycle of fear and self-imposed exile. The tragedy of the Wendels is that they never understood that true wealth is not measured by the number of properties one owns or the amount of money one accumulates. It is measured by the connections one makes, the experiences one has, and the courage to trust the world beyond one's own doors. The Wendels inherited more than just material wealth. They inherited a legacy of fear. And it was this inheritance that doomed them, for no amount of money could ever replace the human connections they had so desperately avoided. In the end, the Wendel fortune was not a blessing, but a curse, a reminder of what happens when protection turns into imprisonment, and wealth becomes a barrier instead of a bridge to the world. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue no longer stands, its towering walls replaced by gleaming glass and steel. What was once the symbol of the Wendel family's empire, an imposing testament to their wealth, power, and isolation, was demolished in the early 1930s, leaving behind no trace except for the story of its decline. The property that stretched across Manhattan, once an empire built on decades of calculated acquisition, was liquidated, its assets swallowed up by developers and distant heirs. But in the end, the most significant remnants of the Wendel legacy are not the scattered pieces of real estate or the fortune lost in legal battles. They are the lessons left behind in the ruins of a family that had everything but never truly lived. The Wendel story is a tragic one, not because of the wealth they amassed, but because of what they failed to do with it. They had everything: vast properties, enormous sums of money, the opportunity to live in a world of comfort and luxury. But they chose to hoard it. Their wealth became a symbol of their isolation, not their success. In their obsession with preserving what they had, they forgot the true purpose of wealth: to create connection, to foster joy, and to participate in the world around them. They protected their riches as if they were all that mattered. But in the end, it was that very protection that isolated them, turning their fortune into a prison rather than a gateway to freedom. The mansion was meant to be a place of refuge, a symbol of the family's triumph. But it became their tomb. Built in the opulent style of the mid-19th century, the house was designed to be a showcase of wealth. Yet inside, it was empty, empty of life, empty of warmth, empty of the very things that make a home. The sisters, trapped in the philosophies their father and brother instilled in them, lived out their final years in a cold and sterile environment, watching the world pass by but never engaging with it. They chose preservation over participation, safety over experience, and in doing so, they condemned themselves to a life of unfulfilled potential. The true tragedy of the Wendels is not the loss of their fortune, but the loss of the opportunity to live. Their father's paranoid philosophy, which convinced them to fear the world outside their mansion's walls, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They isolated themselves from friends, from society, from love, all in the name of protection. The mansion, once a symbol of success, became a monument to fear and distrust. The sisters never learned to embrace the world around them. They never learned to trust. The billions they had inherited became meaningless because they were never used, never enjoyed, never shared. But the lesson of the Wendels is not just one of what happens when wealth is misused. It is also a warning about what happens when we allow fear to rule our lives. The Wendels inherited a fortune, but they also inherited a worldview that kept them locked away in their mansion, unable to connect with the world or experience the joys of living. The mansion they built to protect themselves became the very thing that trapped them. In their obsession with safety, they lost the ability to live with purpose, to trust, and to engage with the world outside their doors. Today, the site where the mansion once stood is home to gleaming office buildings and luxury apartments. The neighborhood around it has evolved, embracing the vibrancy of modern New York. The lesson of the Wendels, however, remains as relevant as ever. Wealth is not a safeguard against the challenges of life. It is not a shield to hide behind. True wealth is not measured by the size of one's bank account or the number of properties owned. It is measured by the connections we make, the relationships we build, and the courage we find to live fully, to trust others, and to embrace the world around us. The Wendel family's fortune, once so vast, was ultimately consumed by their own inability to live beyond their fears. Their wealth, which should have opened doors, closed them instead. The mansion that once stood as a symbol of their success became a reminder of what happens when wealth is hoarded in the name of protection. The true inheritance of the Wendels was not the property or the gold, but the fear that kept them from living. In the end, what we leave behind is not the material things we accumulate, but the impact we have on those around us. The Wendels left behind a legacy of fear, but we have the power to choose what kind of legacy we will create. Will we hoard what we have, guarding it against the world, or will we use it to connect, to build, and to live a life worth remembering? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel to uncover more forgotten stories and lessons hidden in the past. Just like the Wendels, we all inherit something. It's up to us how we choose to use it.